Forget what your history teacher told you. Ancient Egypt wasn't some enlightened land of science and sacred cats. It was a place where you could die just for coughing too loud near a temple. The sun could cook you alive before noon. The Nile gave life and parasites. And if you thought a pyramid was majestic, try hauling the stone that built it until your back snaps in half. Tonight, we're pulling the golden mask off the pharaoh's face and showing you what life was really like when gods ruled and people were treated like dirt. Picture this. You wake up at dawn in ancient Egypt. Not in a palace, not in a temple, but in a mud brick hut, smaller than most modern closets. The floor is packed dirt, the walls cracked from the last flood season, and your bedding is a flattened mat of woven reeds that smells faintly of mildew and sweat. There is no pillow, no softness, no comfort, only the hard press of earth and the certainty of another scorching day. Even before your eyes adjust to the dim gray light, the heat has already begun. It doesn't rise gradually, it ambushes you. The sun hasn't cleared the horizon, yet the air inside your home is thick, unmoving, and oppressively warm. Your body is sticky with sweat that never truly dried from the night before. There's no breeze, no fan, no escape. You pull yourself upright. Your knees ache from yesterday's labor. Your back feels like it's been thrashed with sticks, because in fact, it has been. The overseer caught you pausing at the well too long. You coughed in the wrong moment. That's all it took. There is no concept of rest here. No weekends, no breaks. Your job, the only job you've ever known, is to haul, drag, lift, and suffer beneath the sun. You are one of thousands working on a construction project that you are told will honor the gods. A temple, maybe. A noble's tomb. A granary wall. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that the stones are heavier than you, and they never stop coming. You step outside and are greeted by a wall of heat that feels like it's trying to peel the skin off your face. Already, the ground burns under your feet. You wear simple linen, just enough to cover your body, not nearly enough to protect you. No hat, no shoes. The soles of your feet are calloused, blackened from years of walking on sunlit stone. But today the sand feels sharper somehow, as if it resents you too. There is no breakfast. Not really. Maybe you gnaw on a hunk of bread, coarse, stale, and filled with grit from the stone querns used to grind it. Each bite is like chewing concrete. By the time you're 20, your teeth will be so worn down that eating becomes agony. Archaeologists today can still see the grooves and breakage in mummified jaws, a record of every grain of sand you ever swallowed. If you're lucky, you drink a mouthful of warm beer, not to enjoy it, but because the water might kill you faster. The Nile is sacred, but it's also a disease-ridden highway for parasites, waste, and rot. Everyone you know has worms. Everyone urinates blood by 30. Nobody knows why. Then the orders begin. The overseer's voice is sharp, but it's not the sound that drives fear into your gut. It's the leather strap in his hand. He doesn't shout to motivate. He shouts to remind you. You are disposable. You join the line. Dozens of others like you. Your muscles are already trembling. The stone waiting for you today is roughly the size of a donkey cart, and you will help drag it across the desert floor with nothing but rope, sweat, and hope that no one stumbles. If they do, if you fall behind, you get the whip. If you cry out, that's considered sedition. After all, the Pharaoh is a living god. To complain is to blaspheme. The heat intensifies by the hour. The linen clings to your skin like damp gauze. Your feet slip on the stone ramp slicked with animal fat to reduce friction. Your hands blister on the rope. The sun, now directly overhead, feels less like a source of light and more like a punishment. You've heard stories of men collapsing mid-haul, their hearts simply stopping, cooked from within. No one pauses to mourn. The body is moved. The rope is handed to someone else. You can't stop for water unless permitted. When you do, it's from a clay jug passed around among 50 workers. It's tepid and tastes faintly of algae, but it's all there is. And if you drink too much or too slowly, you're accused of wasting it. Water is rationed not by need, but by quota. There are no gloves, no boots. The friction tears your skin. The heat splits your lips. The sunburn blisters and then peels, layer after layer, until your skin is raw and scarred and darkened beyond recognition. They say Ra, the sun god, watches you work, but he does not intervene. You are not his chosen. You think briefly of your family, your wife grinding grain, back home until her wrists go numb, your child hauling water jars that weigh more than her. You work for them, but also because you must. Refusal means arrest, or worse, assignment to the quarries, where men vanish, ground to dust with the stone they mine. And all of this is normal. This is a good day. You haven't been whipped yet. The stone hasn't crushed your foot. Your body hasn't shut down. You might live to see sunset, but you also might not, because in ancient Egypt, the sun doesn't just rise, it hunts. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating yet terrifying world, take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying the content, and subscribe if you want more historical journeys like this one. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see our global community coming together for these stories. Now, settle in, maybe adjust your pillow, and let's explore why surviving just 24 hours in ancient Egypt would push even the strongest modern person to their absolute limits. This isn't just history. This is a survival story that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you take for granted. Your day in ancient Egypt begins before you even open your eyes. There are no gentle morning rays filtering through curtains, no gradual awakening to soft light. Instead, the Egyptian sun announces itself like a cosmic sledgehammer, blasting through your reed hut with the intensity of a nuclear furnace. By the time you stumble to consciousness, the temperature inside your mud brick dwelling has already climbed past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's not even sunrise yet. The ancient Egyptians worshipped Ra, the sun god, and after spending just one morning in their world, you'd understand why they treated him with such fearful reverence. This wasn't the gentle warmth of a spring afternoon. This was divine wrath made manifest, a celestial entity that seemed personally invested in cooking every living thing beneath its gaze. Your sleeping arrangements offer no protection from this solar assault. You're lying on a woven mat made from reeds, covered by a single linen sheet that's about as effective as tissue paper against a blowtorch. The wealthy might have wooden beds raised off the ground, but for the average Egyptian, the floor is your mattress, and comfort is a luxury you can't afford. As you struggle to your feet, every surface in your home radiates heat like a clay oven. The mud brick walls, baked by yesterday's sun, release their stored thermal energy throughout the night and into the morning. By noon, these same walls will be too hot to touch with bare skin. The floor beneath your feet burns, forcing you to move quickly from shadow to shadow. Though shade itself is precious and rare, ancient Egyptians had no understanding of ultraviolet radiation, but they lived with its consequences daily. Skin cancer rates were likely astronomical, though it rarely mattered. Most people didn't live long enough for long-term sun damage to manifest. The immediate threats were heat stroke, dehydration, and sunburn severe enough to cause fever and blistering. The clothing available offers minimal protection. Linen, made from flax plants, was the fabric of choice because it was light and breathable, but it provided virtually no barrier against the sun's rays. Men wore simple kilts or loincloths. Women wore straight, sleeveless dresses, and both went barefoot most of the time. The idea of wide-brimmed hats, long sleeves, or closed-toe shoes was either unknown or impractical for people who needed to work with their hands and move quickly in the heat. For protection against the sun, the wealthy used perfumed oils and ointments, some containing ingredients that provided minimal sun protection. But for the common people, the best defense was animal fat mixed with herbs, or in desperate cases, mud and even crocodile dung smeared on exposed skin. The effectiveness of these remedies was questionable at best, and they came with their own risks of infection and skin irritation. The psychological impact of living under such relentless heat cannot be understated. Modern studies show that extreme heat affects cognitive function, increases aggression, and reduces the ability to make complex decisions. Imagine trying to perform detailed work, maintain social relationships, or make important life decisions, while your brain slowly cooks inside your skull for 12 hours a day, every day, for your entire life. By 8 in the morning, the temperature has climbed past 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone streets and mud brick buildings begin their daily transformation into heat radiators. Walking barefoot becomes an exercise in pain tolerance, forcing people to develop thick, calloused soles or suffer constant burns and blisters. The heat affects everything around you. Food spoils within hours if not properly stored. Metal tools become too hot to handle without protection. Animals seek whatever shade they can find, often competing with humans for the same precious spots. Even the Nile River, despite its life-giving properties, offers only temporary relief before the sun turns the moisture on your skin into a magnifying glass for its rays. Water becomes your obsession, but not in the way modern people think about hydration. In ancient Egypt, you need water not just to drink, but to cool your body, to wet your clothing for evaporative cooling, and to create mud for protection against the sun. The average person in this climate needs to consume several gallons of water per day to survive. But access to clean water is limited, and often dangerous. Dehydration comes quickly and brutally. The human body can lose up to 2 quarts of water per hour in extreme heat through sweating and breathing. Without constant replenishment, you'll experience headaches, dizziness, and confusion within the first few hours of sun exposure. Heat exhaustion follows, characterized by nausea, rapid heartbeat, and cessation of sweating, a deadly sign that your body's cooling system has failed. Heat stroke, the final stage of heat-related illness, kills quickly and efficiently. Your core body temperature rises above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Your brain begins to malfunction and you lose consciousness. Without immediate cooling and medical intervention, neither of which are available in ancient Egypt, death follows within hours. The ancient Egyptians developed survival strategies over thousands of years of living in this environment. They learned to work in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the deadly midday hours. They built their homes with thick walls and small windows to minimize heat penetration. They wore light-colored clothing to reflect sunlight and used architectural features like courtyards and wind catchers to create cooling breezes. But even with these adaptations, life was a constant battle against the elements. Child mortality rates were staggering, partly due to heat-related illnesses. The elderly and sick were particularly vulnerable, often dying during the hottest months of the year. Even healthy adults faced the constant threat of heat-related death, especially during periods of physical exertion or illness. The psychological adaptation to this environment shaped Egyptian culture in profound ways. The worship of sun gods wasn't just spiritual, it was practical acknowledgement of the power that controlled their daily existence. Religious festivals, often centered around the sun's cycles, and much of Egyptian art and literature reflected the constant awareness of solar power. As you stand in your sweltering hut, sweat already streaming down your face, despite the early hour, you realize that this is just the beginning. The sun will continue to climb for the next 6 hours, reaching temperatures that can kill within minutes of exposure. And this is just day 1 of what would be your entire life in ancient Egypt, assuming you survive long enough to see day 2. With the sun already turning your mud brick home into a furnace, there's only one logical escape: water. The Nile River calls to you like a mirage, promising relief from the heat and a chance to clean the sweat and dust from your body. But as you approach the riverbank, the reality of ancient Egyptian hygiene becomes horrifyingly clear. The mighty Nile, revered as the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization, is simultaneously a blessing and a biological weapon. Yes, it provides the water that makes life possible in the desert, but it's also a cocktail of diseases, parasites, and pollutants that would horrify any modern health inspector. The smell hits you first, a mixture of fish, rotting vegetation, human waste, and decomposing animal matter that hangs in the humid air like an invisible fog. The riverbank bustles with activity. Women washing clothes by pounding them against rocks. Children playing in the shallows. Fishermen mending nets. And animals drinking alongside humans in a scene that would make any epidemiologist weep. Your first challenge is simply getting to the water safely. The banks are muddy and treacherous, filled with hidden holes and slippery vegetation. Crocodiles bask in the sun nearby, their eyes tracking every movement along the water's edge. These aren't the tourist-friendly reptiles of modern zoos. These are Nile crocodiles, apex predators that can grow over 16 feet long and have a bite force strong enough to crush bone. Ancient Egyptian records document numerous crocodile attacks, and the reptiles were both feared and worshipped as manifestations of the god Sobek. Fishermen and laundry workers developed elaborate rituals and prayers to protect themselves, but these offered little real protection against a predator that had been perfecting its hunting techniques for millions of years. Assuming you avoid becoming crocodile food, you wade into the water for your morning bath. The Nile's temperature provides temporary relief from the heat, but the murky brown water conceals a microscopic army of parasites and bacteria eager to colonize your body. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms, was endemic in ancient Egypt. These microscopic larvae penetrate your skin within minutes of water contact, eventually causing chronic pain, organ damage, and bladder cancer. The ancient Egyptians called it the blood disease because infected individuals urinated blood, but they had no understanding of its cause or cure. Guinea worm disease was another common affliction. The larvae, ingested through contaminated water, grow into worms up to 3 feet long inside your body. After a year of internal development, the adult worm emerges through a painful blister on your skin, a process that can take weeks and often leads to secondary infections, disability, or death. River blindness, typhoid, cholera, and dysentery were constant threats. The ancient Egyptians had no concept of waterborne pathogens, so they unknowingly exposed themselves to deadly diseases every time they drank, bathed, or worked near the river. The pollution wasn't just biological. Upstream communities dumped their waste directly into the Nile, including human excrement, dead animals, and the byproducts of various industries. Leather tanning, pottery making, and metalworking all contributed chemicals and toxins to the water supply. During flood season, the river picked up additional contaminants from farms, including animal waste and the decomposing remains of whatever died during the dry season. Soap, as we know it today, didn't exist in ancient Egypt. Instead, you clean yourself with a combination of natron, a naturally occurring salt, plant-based oils, and sand. The sand serves as an abrasive exfoliant, scraping away dead skin, dirt, and parasites, but it also leaves tiny cuts and scratches that provide entry points for infections. The washing process itself is a social affair, conducted in full view of your neighbors, their animals, and any passing strangers. Privacy is a modern luxury unknown in ancient Egypt. Men, women, children, and livestock all share the same bathing areas, further increasing the risk of disease transmission. Women face additional challenges during bathing. Menstrual hygiene products don't exist, and cultural taboos around menstruation mean that women are often considered unclean during their periods. They must still bathe and work, but with added shame and social restrictions that compound the physical difficulties of life in ancient Egypt. After your bath, you're faced with the challenge of drying off and getting dressed without immediately collecting a new layer of dust and insects. The hot air evaporates the water quickly, but it also draws swarms of flies, gnats, and mosquitoes that are attracted to moisture and the scent of clean skin. Clothing must be dried carefully to avoid mold and mildew, which grow rapidly in the humid environment near the river. Many people own only one or two sets of clothes, so damaging or losing garments to the river can be catastrophic. The laundry process itself is dangerous. People regularly drown or are injured by crocodiles while washing clothes in the Nile. The water you collect for drinking and cooking presents additional challenges. It must be carried in heavy clay jars, balanced on your head or shoulders, a skill that takes years to master and places enormous strain on your spine and neck. The jars themselves are fragile and expensive to replace, making every trip to the river a calculated risk. Storage of water in your home attracts insects and accelerates bacterial growth. Without refrigeration or effective filtration, water begins developing dangerous microorganisms within hours of collection. Many families add wine or beer to their water supplies, not for intoxication, but because the alcohol content helps kill some bacteria. The quality of Nile water varies dramatically by season and location. During flood season, the water is thick with sediment, but relatively free of human contamination because the volume dilutes pollutants. During dry season, the water is clearer but more concentrated with waste and chemicals from upstream activities. Navigation around the river requires constant vigilance. The channels shift regularly due to flooding and sedimentation. Sandbars and submerged obstacles change location without warning. Hippos, though less common than crocodiles, are actually more dangerous to humans, killing more people in Africa than any other large animal due to their territorial nature and powerful jaws. Fishing in these waters is both necessary for survival and incredibly hazardous. The Nile contains numerous species of venomous fish and rays that can cause painful, sometimes fatal injuries. Electric catfish can deliver shocks powerful enough to stun a human adult. Ancient fishing nets and hooks were crude compared to modern equipment, leading to frequent injuries and equipment loss. As you emerge from your morning bath, marginally cleaner but significantly more exposed to disease, you face the sobering reality that this same dangerous ritual must be repeated daily for the rest of your life. The Nile gives life to Egypt, but it demands a heavy price in return, one paid in blood, disease, and constant fear. The ancient Egyptians developed an elaborate religious and cultural relationship with their river, precisely because it was so dangerous. They worshipped it not out of simple gratitude, but out of desperate need to appease the powerful forces that could grant life or death with equal ease. Every day brought the same terrible choice: risk the river's dangers or die of thirst and filth in the desert heat. After your perilous morning bath, your stomach reminds you of another fundamental challenge of ancient Egyptian life: finding enough food to survive another day. But as you prepare to break your fast, you quickly discover that ancient Egyptian cuisine would challenge even the strongest modern digestive system. Your breakfast table, if you're fortunate enough to have one, is a low wooden platform, barely a foot off the ground. More likely, you'll squat on a reed mat or simply sit in the dirt, surrounded by the ever-present flies that treat every meal as their personal buffet. The morning meal, like all meals in ancient Egypt, is less about pleasure and more about basic survival. The centerpiece of your breakfast is bread, dense, coarse, and often as dangerous as it is nourishing. Ancient Egyptian bread was made from emmer wheat or barley, grains that were ground between stone querns that inevitably shed particles of rock into the flour. Every bite contains enough sand and stone fragments to gradually wear down your teeth to painful stubs. Archaeological evidence from ancient Egyptian mummies shows that even wealthy individuals had severely worn teeth by their 20s, with many suffering from abscesses and bone infections that could prove fatal. The poor, who ate more bread and had less access to varied foods, often had their teeth ground down nearly to the gum line. By middle age, the bread-making process itself is fraught with contamination risks. Grain is stored in large clay jars that also house mice, rats, and insects. The flour often contains insect eggs, rodent droppings, and various fungi that can cause serious illness. Ancient Egyptian bakers had no understanding of food safety, so cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods was routine. Your bread is accompanied by beer, but don't expect anything resembling modern brewing standards. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and often contained floating particles of grain and yeast. It was more like liquid bread than the clear, filtered beverages we know today. The alcohol content was low, typically around 2 to 3%, but it was safer to drink than water because the brewing process killed many harmful bacteria. However, the beer came with its own risks. Contamination during brewing could produce methanol instead of ethanol, causing blindness or death. Improper storage led to bacterial infections that turned the beer into a toxic soup. The fermentation process attracted flies and other insects, which left their eggs and waste in the brewing vessels. If you're lucky enough to have additional food, it might include onions, garlic, or dried dates, foods that helped prevent scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies, but did little to make meals more appetizing. Onions were so valued in ancient Egypt that they were used as currency to pay workers, but eating them raw on an empty stomach often caused severe digestive distress. Protein is scarce and dangerous. Fish from the Nile carry parasites and toxins from polluted water. Poultry and eggs are luxuries for the wealthy, and they spoil rapidly in the heat. Most protein comes from legumes like lentils and chickpeas, which provide essential amino acids, but also cause digestive problems for people unaccustomed to high-fiber diets. The cooking process in ancient Egypt wasn't a domestic ritual. It was daily warfare against fire, filth, and suffocation. For the average household, preparing a meal meant stepping into a smoke-filled battleground, where each moment flirted with burns, infection, or worse. The hearth, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a stone circle or a pit dug into the packed dirt floor of your home. There were no chimneys, no ventilation, just a low flame fed by whatever fuel could be found. Most often, dried animal dung. Wood was rare and far too valuable to waste on daily meals, so cow dung, carefully shaped into discs and left to dry in the sun, became the standard. It burned slow, but not clean. The smoke it produced was thick, acrid, and persistent. Within minutes of lighting the fire, your entire home became a low-lying smokehouse. The walls, mud brick, dry and crumbly, absorbed none of it. The air turned heavy and stung the eyes. Children coughed until their chests rattled, and the women, always the women, stayed closest to the flame, eyes watering, skin stinging, mouths pressed into sleeves to avoid inhaling too much. This smoke was more than just an annoyance. Studies of preserved lung tissue from mummies show signs of chronic smoke exposure, soot-lined bronchi, blackened alveoli, and lung scarring consistent with long-term indoor fire inhalation. For many, cooking was a slow death sentence, a daily accumulation of damage to lungs, throat, and eyes. But smoke wasn't the only hazard. The open flames, set low to the ground and surrounded by flammable fabrics, baskets, and dried reeds, were notoriously unstable. A misstep, a breeze, a moment's distraction, and the entire structure could go up in flames. Mud brick does not burn, but straw roofs do, and in neighborhoods where homes are packed tightly together, fire spreads quickly. One overturned pot could destroy a dozen homes. Children were often injured first, curious fingers reaching too close, bare feet stepping into coals. But it was the women, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, who bore the brunt of cooking-related injuries. Burns to the hands, forearms, and faces were common. Severe scalding from boiling beer or oil was even worse, and without antiseptics, gauze, or surgical treatment, these wounds rarely healed cleanly. Infection followed, fast, aggressive, and unforgiving. The heat of Egypt accelerated bacterial growth, and with no soap and limited access to clean water, even minor burns could turn septic within days. A woman burned during cooking might live with pain for weeks before succumbing to fever, or worse, have her injury covered with animal fat and herbs, a remedy that sealed an infection rather than treating it. There were no fire brigades, no water buckets at the ready, no communal systems of warning. When a cooking fire got out of control, the response was chaos. Neighbors shouting, children screaming, men rushing to smother flames with sand or clay. Entire neighborhoods, especially in crowded villages along the floodplain, could vanish in the space of an hour. And still, the next morning, the fire pits would be rebuilt because food had to be cooked, no matter the cost. Insects flocked to the flames. Flies buzzed in clouds around uncovered pots. Smoke attracted them, not deterred them. Drawn to the moisture of boiling barley, the sweetness of date syrup, the animal fat simmering in low clay bowls, they landed on everything: eggs, eyes, open wounds. And yet, cooking continued, because it had to. Bread had to be baked. Beer had to be boiled. Lentils had to be softened, or else go uneaten. Even if your eyes streamed with tears and your lungs burned with each breath, the fire had to be fed. The pot had to be stirred. This was the rhythm of daily life in ancient Egypt. Not ceremony, not luxury, just survival. One acrid breath at a time. Food storage in ancient Egypt is practically impossible. Without refrigeration, meat spoils within hours in the desert heat. Vegetables wilt and rot quickly. Grains must be carefully protected from rodents and insects. But ancient storage methods are primitive and often ineffective. Many families exist in a constant state of near starvation, never more than a day or two away from hunger. The spices and seasonings available are limited and expensive. Salt is precious because it must be imported or extracted from desert deposits through dangerous journeys. Most food is bland by modern standards, seasoned only with wild herbs and occasionally honey, when available and affordable. Dairy products present special challenges. Milk spoils within hours in the heat, and ancient preservation methods like cheese making require skills and equipment that most families lack. When milk is available, it's often contaminated with bacteria that cause severe diarrhea and dehydration. The social dynamics of eating add another layer of complexity to meals. Families often share food from common bowls, spreading diseases and parasites among family members. Food distribution within households follows strict hierarchies. Men eat first and best, followed by older children, with women and young children receiving whatever remains. Seasonal variations dramatically affect food availability. During flood season, fresh foods are more plentiful, but storage becomes even more difficult due to increased humidity and insect activity. During dry seasons, food becomes scarce and prices soar, forcing families to survive on minimal rations or go hungry. The grinding of grain, typically done by women using stone querns, is back-breaking labor that takes hours each day. The repetitive motion causes severe arthritis and joint damage. The stone dust, created during grinding, contributes to respiratory problems, and the physical strain often leads to permanent spinal damage. Food preparation requires constant vigilance against contamination. Without soap or effective cleaning methods, cooking utensils and eating vessels harbor dangerous bacteria. Clay pots crack and develop cracks that are impossible to clean properly. Wooden utensils absorb food particles and bacteria that can survive for weeks. Water used in cooking comes from the same contaminated Nile sources used for bathing, adding another layer of disease risk to every meal. The water must be boiled for safety, but fuel for fires is expensive and scarce, forcing families to choose between food safety and economic survival. Malnutrition is endemic among the poor. Most people survive on a diet consisting primarily of bread and beer, with occasional vegetables when available. This limited diet leads to vitamin deficiencies, stunted growth, and increased susceptibility to disease. Children often show signs of malnutrition by age 5, and many never reach full physical development. The wealthy eat better, but face different risks. Their more varied diets include imported foods that may be contaminated or spoiled from long journeys. Rich foods like honey and oils attract insects and rodents. Elaborate feast preparations increase the risk of food poisoning due to longer preparation times and more complex dishes. Religious dietary restrictions add complexity to an already challenging food system. Certain animals are forbidden during specific religious periods, Some foods are reserved for temple offerings, reducing availability for general consumption. Religious fasting periods can push marginally nourished people over the edge into starvation. As you finish your gritty breakfast, wiping sand from your teeth and brushing flies from your beer cup, the reality sets in. This meal, dangerous and unappetizing as it is, may be the best food you'll eat all day. In ancient Egypt, every meal is a calculated risk between starvation and poisoning, and tomorrow's food is never guaranteed. The sun is climbing higher now, and your brief respite from the heat is ending. It's time to face the next challenge of ancient Egyptian life, work that will push your body to its absolute limits under a merciless sun that shows no mercy to the weak or unprepared. With your meager breakfast consumed and the sun climbing toward its murderous zenith, the time for rest is over. In ancient Egypt, work begins before dawn and continues until your body can no longer function, and the type of labor awaiting you would break most modern people within hours, unless you're among the tiny elite of scribes, priests, or royalty, which statistically you're not. Your day involves backbreaking physical labor under conditions that would violate every modern workplace safety standard. The ancient Egyptian economy ran on human muscle power, and that muscle was expendable, replaceable, and brutally exploited. If you're a farmer, which most Egyptians were, your workday begins with a journey to fields that may be miles from your home. You walk barefoot across burning sand and sharp stones, carrying primitive tools that haven't changed much in centuries. Your wooden plow is pulled by oxen if you're fortunate, by human power if you're not. The blade is crude metal or hardened wood that barely scratches the sun-baked earth. The irrigation system that makes Egyptian agriculture possible requires constant maintenance. You spend countless hours digging and clearing channels, hauling buckets of water, and operating shadoofs, primitive lever systems that lift water from the Nile to higher ground. This work is performed in full sun, bending and lifting repeatedly until your spine screams in protest and your hands bleed from rope burns. Planting and harvesting are races against time and weather. During planting season, you must prepare fields, sow seeds, and establish irrigation before the floodwaters recede. During harvest, you race to cut and gather grain before the brutal heat destroys the crop or sandstorms bury it. There are no mechanical aids, no powered tools, just your body against the elements. The harvesting itself is performed with crude sickles that require you to bend over for hours, cutting grain stalks one at a time. Your back develops permanent curvature from this posture. Your hands develop deep calluses and frequent cuts from the sharp tools and grain stalks. The harvest must continue, regardless of weather, through sandstorms, extreme heat, or the occasional flash flood. Construction workers face even worse conditions. If you're building pyramids, temples, or other monuments, you're hauling massive stone blocks across desert terrain using only ropes, wooden rollers, and human strength. The limestone blocks used in pyramid construction weigh between 2 and 15 tons each. Moving them requires teams of dozens of workers pulling in perfect coordination under overseers who enforce discipline with whips and clubs. The quarries where stone is extracted are death traps, Workers use copper chisels and wooden hammers to split rock, a process that creates clouds of stone dust that destroys lungs and causes a painful death from silicosis. The constant hammering damages hearing and causes repetitive stress injuries. Cave-ins and falling rocks kill workers regularly, and their bodies are simply removed so work can continue. Transportation of materials requires building massive ramps and moving systems. Workers carry loads that would require machinery today, often walking for miles, with heavy stones balanced on wooden stretchers. The ramps are steep and treacherous, and falls from height are common and usually fatal. The heat makes all work exponentially more dangerous. During summer months, the stone surfaces become hot enough to cause severe burns on contact. Metal tools become too hot to handle without protection that doesn't exist. Workers must labor in temperatures that regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with no shade, no rest periods, and no protection from the sun. Dehydration and heat stroke kill workers daily during the construction season. There's no organized system for providing water or medical care. Workers who collapse are often left to die while others continue working. The ancient Egyptians viewed human life as cheap and easily replaceable, especially for foreign slaves and prisoners of war. For women, work is equally demanding, but different in nature. You spend your day grinding grain using heavy stone querns, a process that takes hours and destroys your joints and spine. The repetitive circular motion required to grind grain into flour causes severe arthritis and permanent damage to wrists and shoulders. Many women develop a characteristic hunched posture from years of grain grinding. Textile production is another major source of female labor. You must spin thread using primitive spindles, then weave cloth on basic looms. The work requires precise hand movements for hours at a time, causing repetitive stress injuries. The linen fibers are harsh and cause cuts and irritation on your hands and arms. Hauling water is a daily burden that falls primarily on women and children. You must walk to the Nile multiple times per day, fill heavy clay jars, and carry them back home balanced on your head or shoulders. The weight, often 40 to 60 pounds, causes severe neck and spine damage over time. The clay jars are fragile and expensive to replace, making every trip a risk of financial disaster. Domestic work includes food preparation, childcare, cleaning, and maintenance of the home and family possessions. There are no labor-saving devices, no mechanical aids, and no time off. You work from before dawn until after sunset every day of your life. The overseers who supervise work are armed with whips and clubs, and they use them liberally. Beatings are routine for any perceived laziness, mistakes, or defiance. The scars from these beatings mark workers for life, and infections from untreated wounds often prove fatal. Work quotas are set impossibly high and enforced ruthlessly. If a team fails to meet production targets, all members are punished collectively. This creates a system where workers push themselves and each other beyond safe limits to avoid group punishment. There are no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, and no retirement. You work until you're physically unable to continue. Then you become dependent on family for survival, or you die. Industrial accidents are common, and usually result in permanent disability or death. The tools provided are primitive and dangerous. Copper and bronze implements are soft and break easily, often causing injury when they fail. Wooden handles split and cause splinters. Stone tools are heavy and unwieldy, requiring enormous strength to use effectively. The work environment is contaminated with dust, chemicals, and biological hazards. Limestone dust from construction causes lung disease. Chemicals used in metalworking and pottery cause skin and respiratory problems. Animal waste used as fertilizer spreads disease and parasites. Perhaps most horrifying is the expendability of human life in these work systems. If you're injured and can't work, you're simply replaced. If you die on the job, your body is removed and work continues immediately. There are no investigations, no compensation for families, and no efforts to prevent similar deaths. The Pharaoh's projects are more important than any individual life, and this reality shapes every moment of your working existence. The psychological toll of this labor system is immense. You live in constant fear of injury, death, or punishment. You watch friends and family members worked to death or killed in accidents. You know that your own life has no value beyond your ability to produce labor, and that knowledge weighs on you every moment of every day. Seasonal variations in work create periods of intense activity, followed by relative quiet. But there's never true rest. During flood season, when agricultural work stops, you are conscripted for construction projects. During planting and harvest, you work 18-hour days to meet deadlines. The cycle never ends, and neither does the physical and emotional stress. As the sun reaches its peak intensity around noon, any pretense of comfortable working conditions disappears entirely. The choice becomes simple: continue working and risk heat stroke and death, or stop working and face punishment from overseers. For most ancient Egyptians, it's not really a choice at all. As sweat pours down your face and your muscles scream in protest from the morning's labor, you might be tempted to voice a complaint, to question why you must endure such suffering while others live in luxury. But in ancient Egypt, such thoughts are not just dangerous, they're potentially fatal. The pharaoh isn't merely a political leader, he's a living god, and questioning divine authority is the ultimate blasphemy. The concept of pharaonic divinity permeates every aspect of Egyptian society in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. This isn't symbolic leadership or ceremonial authority. It's literal belief in divine incarnation. The pharaoh is considered the physical manifestation of Horus on earth, the son of Ra, chosen by the gods themselves to maintain cosmic order through absolute rule. Your daily life is structured around this divine hierarchy from the moment you wake until you collapse in exhaustion. Every law, every social custom, every work assignment flows from the pharaoh's divine will. To question any aspect of this system isn't political dissent. It's theological heresy that threatens the cosmic balance maintaining the universe itself. The pharaoh's image is everywhere, impossible to escape or ignore. Massive statues line the roads and dominate public spaces, their faces carved with expressions of eternal authority and divine wisdom. These aren't mere artistic representations, but are believed to contain actual divine presence. You must show proper reverence when passing them, and failure to do so can result in accusations of impiety. Temple walls throughout Egypt display scenes of the pharaoh receiving divine authority directly from the gods, making offerings that maintain cosmic order, and defeating Egypt's enemies with supernatural power. These images aren't propaganda in the modern sense. They're considered accurate historical records of divine intervention in human affairs. The pharaoh's name appears in cartouches on everything from monumental architecture to bread molds, each inscription carrying religious significance. Speaking his name casually or without proper titles is forbidden for commoners. Most people never learn the pharaoh's actual name, referring to him only by titles like His Majesty or the Lord of the Two Lands. Royal pronouncements carry the weight of divine command. When the pharaoh decrees new taxes, work assignments, or laws, these aren't seen as political decisions, but as divine revelations necessary for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order that keeps the universe functioning properly. The enforcement of divine authority operates through a vast bureaucratic system that reaches into every village and household. Local officials, scribes, and priests all serve as extensions of pharaonic power, reporting on public sentiment and identifying potential dissidents. This surveillance system makes private criticism extremely dangerous, as neighbors, co-workers, and even family members might report seditious speech to authorities. Punishment for questioning pharaonic authority is swift and severe. Minor complaints might result in public beatings or increased work assignments. More serious criticism can lead to imprisonment, forced labor in mines or quarries, or execution. The punishments are designed not just to deter the individual, but to send a message to the entire community about the consequences of defying divine will. The religious justification for absolute authority extends to practical governance. When the Nile floods fail and crops suffer, this isn't seen as natural disaster, but as divine displeasure requiring greater devotion to the pharaoh. When plagues strike or enemies invade, these are interpreted as cosmic imbalances that can only be corrected through stronger royal authority and more elaborate religious observances. Economic exploitation is similarly justified through religious doctrine. The massive resources devoted to pyramid construction, temple building, and royal burials aren't seen as waste, but as necessary investments in cosmic stability. Your backbreaking labor and poverty are portrayed as honorable service to divine order rather than exploitation by human rulers. The pharaoh's divine status means that his physical presence is considered too sacred for direct contact with commoners. If you're fortunate enough to see him during public ceremonies, you must prostrate yourself completely, pressing your face to the ground and remaining motionless until given permission to rise. Looking directly at his face is forbidden and can result in immediate execution. Royal ceremonies reinforce divine authority through elaborate rituals that combine religious observance with political theater. These events, often lasting for days, include processions where the pharaoh appears in golden regalia, divine offerings that demonstrate his special relationship with the gods, and public declarations of royal achievements that border on the miraculous. The concept of royal divinity affects legal systems in fundamental ways. The pharaoh is considered the source of all justice, and legal decisions are made not based on evidence or precedent, but on divine inspiration channeled through royal authority. Judges are essentially priests interpreting divine will, rather than secular officials applying human law. Military service takes on religious significance. When you're fighting for a divine ruler, soldiers aren't just defending territory or political interests. They're protecting cosmic order itself. Death in service to the pharaoh is portrayed as religious martyrdom that guarantees favorable treatment in the afterlife. The divine authority system creates a psychological environment where questioning any aspect of your suffering becomes impossible. If you're poor, hungry, or overworked, this must be either divine punishment for your sins or divine testing of your faith. Either way, the solution is greater devotion to pharaonic authority rather than political reform. Education and literacy are carefully controlled to maintain this system. Only a tiny percentage of the population can read and write, and those who can are carefully selected and trained to support royal authority. Religious texts and official documents constantly reinforce divine kingship, while alternative viewpoints are simply never recorded or taught. The economic system that keeps you in poverty is justified as divine mandate. The pharaoh owns all land, all resources, and effectively all people as extensions of his divine authority. Your labor belongs to him not through conquest or contract, but through cosmic right established by the gods themselves. Foreign visitors to Egypt often express amazement at the complete absence of political dissent or criticism of royal authority. This isn't because Egyptians are naturally submissive, but because the religious and political systems have been so thoroughly integrated that questioning pharaonic authority literally doesn't exist as a conceptual possibility for most people. Social mobility is theoretically possible through service to the divine pharaoh, but it requires complete abandonment of any independent thought or criticism. The few commoners who rise in status do so by demonstrating absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience to royal authority, becoming enforcers of the same system that oppressed them. The afterlife beliefs reinforce temporal authority by promising that loyalty to the pharaoh in this life determines your fate in the next. The Book of the Dead contains numerous passages about serving royal authority as a path to eternal reward, while disloyalty leads to spiritual destruction by monsters like Ammit, the soul-devouring creature with the head of a crocodile. Even natural disasters are interpreted through the lens of divine authority. When sandstorms rage or the Nile fails to flood properly, these aren't seen as weather patterns, but as signs of cosmic displeasure, requiring greater devotion to pharaonic rule. Your suffering becomes proof of the need for stronger royal authority, rather than evidence of its failure. The isolation of Egypt from other political systems helps maintain this divine authority model. Most Egyptians never encounter alternative forms of government or different concepts of leadership, so pharaonic divinity seems natural and inevitable rather than one possible system among many. As you return to your back-breaking labor under the merciless sun, every ache in your body and every drop of sweat on your face serves as a reminder that your suffering is not just tolerated, but divinely ordained. In ancient Egypt, there is no appeal to higher authority because the highest authority is the source of your oppression, and questioning that authority means questioning the fundamental order of the universe itself. As you labor through the scorching afternoon, bent over your tools, while overseers watch for any sign of weakness, you begin to understand that the human oppression you face is only part of your struggle for survival. In ancient Egypt, there's another enemy that's even more persistent, more invasive, and more inescapable than any pharaoh or taskmaster: sand. Sand isn't just an inconvenience in ancient Egypt. It's a living force that infiltrates every aspect of existence, transforming daily life into a constant battle against an enemy that can't be defeated, only temporarily held at bay. It's in your food, your water, your clothes, your home, and your lungs. It follows you everywhere, accumulates faster than you can remove it, and slowly wears down everything you own, including your body. Your clothing, made from linen that would clean this morning, is now permeated with fine grains that chafe against your skin with every movement. The loose weave that makes linen bearable in the heat also makes it perfectly suited for collecting and holding sand particles. Every step you take, every gust of wind, every contact with any surface adds more grit to your garments. The sand works its way under your clothing, accumulating in folds and creases where it mixes with sweat to form an abrasive paste that rubs your skin raw. Your underarms, groin, and the areas where your clothing fits tightly develop painful rashes and open sores from the constant friction of sand-contaminated fabric against sensitive skin. Your feet, bare or protected only by simple reed sandals, bear the worst of the sandy assault. The soles of your feet develop thick calluses from walking on hot sand and sharp stones. But even these natural protections can't prevent painful cuts and embedded particles that cause infections. Sand works its way between your toes and under your toenails, creating constant discomfort and perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. Inside your home, sand accumulates faster than you can sweep it out. It sifts through cracks in the walls, blows under doors, and settles on every surface throughout the day and night. Your sleeping mat becomes gritty within hours of cleaning, and you spend your nights trying to find positions that minimize contact with the sandy residue that covers everything. Your food preparation becomes an exercise in futility as sand contaminates every meal despite your best efforts. Vegetables gathered from the fields carry sand in their leaves and roots. Grain stored in clay vessels somehow accumulates sand particles that crack between your teeth when you eat bread. Even covered cooking pots collect sand that falls from the ceiling or blows in during food preparation. The bread that forms the cornerstone of your diet becomes a vehicle for dental destruction as sand particles from the grinding stones mix with flour during preparation. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Egyptians had severely worn teeth by their 20s due to the constant grinding action of sand particles in their food. The pain from worn teeth and exposed nerves adds another layer of misery to your daily existence. Water storage and consumption present constant challenges as sand settles in clay jars and water vessels. You must filter water through cloth to remove the largest particles, but fine sand continues to pass through, giving every drink a gritty texture and adding to the gradual erosion of your digestive system. Sandstorms transform your already difficult life into a nightmare of survival. These massive walls of wind-driven sand can appear with little warning, turning day into night and making breathing nearly impossible. During a sandstorm, you must seal yourself inside your home as best you can, covering your nose and mouth with cloth while sand infiltrates every opening despite your efforts. The psychological impact of living in a sandstorm can't be overstated. Visibility drops to zero, making navigation impossible. The howling wind creates a deafening roar that prevents communication. Sand particles, driven by hurricane-force winds, sting exposed skin like tiny needles, forcing you to cover completely or risk serious injury. After a sandstorm passes, you emerge to find your world transformed. Sand drifts cover pathways and doorways. Your carefully maintained home is buried under inches of new sand that must be laboriously removed before normal life can resume. Tools, pottery, and other possessions may be buried or damaged beyond repair by the abrasive action of wind-driven sand. The economic impact of sand damage is devastating for families living at subsistence levels. Clay pots crack from thermal expansion and sand abrasion. Wooden tools wear out rapidly from constant sand exposure. Textiles deteriorate quickly as sand particles cut through fibers with every movement and washing. Agricultural work becomes exponentially more difficult when sand covers planted fields or irrigation channels. You must constantly clear sand from waterways to maintain irrigation flow. Planted crops can be completely buried by a single sandstorm, destroying months of work and threatening your family's food security for the coming year. Construction and maintenance work requires constant adaptation to sandy conditions. Mortar mixed for building projects becomes contaminated with sand, weakening structures. Tools become clogged with sand, reducing their effectiveness and requiring frequent cleaning. The sand acts as an abrasive that rapidly dulls cutting edges and wears down working surfaces. Your respiratory system bears a heavy burden from constant sand exposure. Fine particles inhaled throughout your life accumulate in your lungs, causing chronic cough, respiratory infections, and eventual lung disease. The combination of sand inhalation and smoke from cooking fires creates respiratory conditions that significantly reduce life expectancy. Personal hygiene becomes nearly impossible to maintain when sand contamination is constant. You can bathe in the Nile every morning, but within hours, you're covered with a new layer of sand and dust. Hair becomes matted with sand particles that are nearly impossible to remove completely. Your scalp develops irritation and infections from the constant presence of abrasive particles. The sand affects your mental state as well as your physical condition. The constant gritty feeling in your mouth, between your teeth, and on your skin creates a persistent low-level irritation that makes concentration difficult and sleep fitful. The knowledge that you can never be truly clean or comfortable adds to the psychological burden of survival in ancient Egypt. Working with tools and implements becomes frustrating and dangerous when sand interferes with their operation. Cutting implements become dull rapidly. Moving parts on simple machines become clogged and difficult to operate. The sand acts as a grinding compound that accelerates wear on everything you use. Perhaps most maddening is the futility of fighting against sand accumulation. You can spend hours cleaning and organizing your living space, only to watch it become sandy again within a day. This endless cycle of cleaning and recontamination creates a sense of helplessness that compounds the other stresses of ancient Egyptian life. You're not just fighting poverty, disease, and oppression. You're fighting the very landscape itself, and it's a battle you can never win. The sand gets into mechanical devices and tools, causing them to jam, wear out quickly, or break at critical moments. Simple devices like door hinges, loom mechanisms, and grain grinding equipment require constant maintenance and frequent replacement due to sand damage. Artistic and craft work suffers from sand contamination as well. Pottery glazes become rough and uneven from sand particles. Textile work is complicated by sand that cuts threads and damages looms. Even simple tasks like writing or record keeping become difficult when sand particles interfere with ink and writing surfaces. As the afternoon sun beats down mercilessly and sand swirls around your feet with every movement, you realize that this granular enemy will be your constant companion for every remaining day of your life. In ancient Egypt, sand isn't just part of the environment. It's a hostile force that wages war against human comfort, health, and sanity with relentless persistence and inevitable victory. As the sun reaches its merciless peak and your body screams for relief from the morning's brutal labor, you might hope for a moment of respite, a brief escape from the physical demands of survival in ancient Egypt. But there is no escape, because every aspect of your existence is governed by an intricate web of religious obligations that demand constant attention, precise performance, and unwavering devotion. In ancient Egypt, religion isn't a weekly observance or personal choice. It's the operating system that controls every decision, every action, and every moment of your life. The gods are everywhere, watching your every move, judging your every thought, and demanding tribute, worship, and absolute obedience 24 hours a day. Your day begins before dawn, not just with physical labor, but with religious obligations that can't be ignored without risking divine wrath. You must offer prayers to Ra as the sun rises, thanking him for another day of life, while begging for protection from his burning rays. These aren't casual requests, but formal invocations that must be spoken with precise words and proper ritual gestures. Before eating your meager breakfast, you must set aside a portion for the gods: bread that you can barely spare, beer that represents a significant portion of your daily calories, and any other food you've managed to obtain. This offering isn't optional charity, but mandatory tribute that ensures the gods continue to provide sustenance and prevent your family from starving. The pantheon of Egyptian gods is vast and confusing, with overlapping domains, conflicting mythologies, and constantly changing hierarchies that require expert knowledge to navigate safely. There's Ra, the sun god whose approval you need to survive each scorching day. Osiris, lord of the underworld, who will judge your soul after death. Isis, the mother goddess who controls fertility and childbirth. Horus, the sky god associated with pharaonic power. Set, the god of chaos, who must be appeased but never trusted. Each god has specific requirements, preferred offerings, particular feast days, and unique taboos that can bring disaster if violated. Keeping track of all these religious obligations while struggling for basic survival creates constant anxiety about inadvertently offending divine powers and bringing catastrophe upon yourself and your family. Local temples dominate your community, both physically and economically. These massive stone structures consume enormous resources that could otherwise support human needs. But questioning this allocation of wealth is impossible because the temples are considered divine property. The priests who control these temples wield power that rivals or exceeds that of secular authorities. Temple obligations extend far beyond simple worship. You're expected to contribute labor for temple construction and maintenance, even when your own home is falling apart and your family needs your work for survival. During religious festivals, normal economic activity stops, while everyone participates in elaborate ceremonies that can last for days or weeks. The priests who mediate between humans and gods represent another layer of authority that shapes your daily existence. These aren't humble spiritual guides, but powerful officials who control access to divine favor, interpret religious law, and determine whether your offerings are acceptable to the gods. Their approval is necessary for major life decisions, business transactions, and legal disputes. Religious festivals occur frequently throughout the year, each requiring specific preparations, special foods, particular clothing, and prescribed behaviors that strain your limited resources. The Festival of Opet, celebrating the divine marriage between Amun and Mut, requires weeks of preparation and community-wide participation that disrupts normal work and economic activity. During the beautiful Festival of the Valley, you must visit the tombs of your ancestors, bringing offerings of food and drink that you can barely afford. This isn't just cultural tradition, but religious requirement, as neglecting the dead brings their wrath upon the living and disrupts the cosmic order that keeps the world functioning. Personal hygiene and daily activities are governed by religious prescriptions that add complexity to already difficult survival challenges. Certain foods are forbidden during specific religious periods. Particular activities are prohibited on sacred days. Even basic functions like bathing and sleeping have religious dimensions that must be carefully observed. Menstruation makes women ritually impure, requiring isolation and purification ceremonies that compound the practical difficulties of ancient life. Pregnant women face additional religious obligations and restrictions that can interfere with their ability to work and provide for their families. The concept of Ma'at, divine order, truth, and justice, requires constant vigilance about moral behavior. Every lie, Every unkind act, every moment of anger or resentment is recorded by the gods and will be weighed against you in the afterlife judgment. This creates psychological pressure to maintain perfect behavior while living under conditions that would test the patience of saints. Death brings its own religious burdens that can financially destroy families. Proper mummification, while less elaborate for common people than for pharaohs, still requires significant expense for materials and priestly services. Burial goods, tomb construction, and funerary rituals consume resources that living family members desperately need. The Book of the Dead, containing spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, must be purchased from scribes and priests if your family wants any hope of your soul reaching the field of reeds. These religious texts are expensive luxury items that poor families often can't afford, leaving them spiritually vulnerable and adding to their anxiety about death and judgment. Religious law governs business transactions, marriage arrangements, property disputes, and criminal justice. There is no separation between secular and religious authority. The God's will determines legal outcomes, and priestly interpretation shapes judicial decisions. This means that religious standing affects your access to justice and legal protection. Amulets and protective charms are considered essential for daily survival, but these religious items must be purchased from authorized craftsmen and blessed by legitimate priests. The expense of maintaining proper spiritual protection adds another financial burden to families already struggling with basic necessities. Seasonal religious obligations follow the agricultural calendar, requiring specific rituals during planting and harvest times. These ceremonies are believed to ensure good crops and prevent natural disasters, making participation mandatory for agricultural communities. Failure to perform proper rituals can bring collective punishment on entire villages. The afterlife judgment process requires a lifetime of preparation and spiritual accumulation. Your heart will be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and any moral failings will result in destruction by Ammit, the soul-eating monster. This knowledge creates constant anxiety about death and judgment, adding psychological stress to the physical hardships of daily life. Religious education for children begins early and consumes time and resources that could be devoted to practical skills. Children must learn prayers, rituals, mythologies, and proper behaviors toward gods and religious authorities. This education is necessary for spiritual survival, but doesn't contribute to economic productivity or family welfare. The complexity of religious obligations means that mistakes are inevitable, and these spiritual errors can have serious consequences. Improper offerings might offend gods and bring divine punishment. Incorrect rituals could fail to provide necessary protection. Forgotten observances might result in spiritual disaster for individuals or communities. Temple personnel form a privileged class that consumes community resources while contributing little to productive economic activity. Priests, temple singers, dancers, craftsmen, and administrators all require support from the general population, creating an economic burden that reduces resources available for basic survival needs. The fear of divine punishment permeates every aspect of decision-making. Should you eat this food that might be ritually impure? Is it safe to work on this day that might be sacred? Will this business transaction offend gods who control commerce? These constant spiritual calculations add stress and uncertainty to already difficult survival choices as you struggle through another scorching afternoon. Every bead of sweat on your face and every ache in your muscles is accompanied by awareness that the gods are watching, judging, and recording your performance for future judgment. In ancient Egypt, there's no escape from divine surveillance, no relief from religious obligation, and no separation between spiritual duty and daily survival. When illness strikes in ancient Egypt, and it strikes often and brutally, you quickly discover that seeking medical treatment can be as dangerous as the disease itself. Ancient Egyptian medicine, while advanced for its time, operates on a combination of genuine medical knowledge, religious superstition, and treatments that would horrify modern medical professionals. Your local healer is part doctor, part priest, and part magician, reflecting the Egyptian belief that illness stems from both physical and supernatural causes. Disease isn't simply a biological malfunction, but often represents divine punishment, demonic possession, or spiritual imbalance that requires both medical treatment and religious intervention to cure. The diagnostic process begins with questions about your recent behavior, religious observances, and possible offenses against gods or spirits. Have you failed to make proper offerings? Have you violated any taboos? Have you angered any neighbors who might have cursed you? These spiritual considerations are as important as physical symptoms in determining treatment. Physical examination is crude and invasive. The healer pokes and prods your body with unwashed hands, spreads body fluids for inspection, and makes diagnoses based on the color, smell, and texture of various bodily excretions. There is no concept of infection control or sterile technique, so the examination itself often introduces new diseases and complications. Pain relief is primitive and often ineffective. Willow bark, containing compounds similar to aspirin, provides some relief for headaches and joint pain, but dosages are inconsistent and side effects are poorly understood. Opium is available but expensive and reserved primarily for the wealthy or for surgical procedures. Most pain management relies on alcohol, beer or wine, consumed in quantities that provide temporary numbness, but contribute to dehydration, malnutrition, and liver damage. The line between therapeutic drinking and alcoholism is blurred, and many patients develop substance abuse problems while seeking relief from chronic pain. Surgical procedures are performed without anesthesia, beyond alcohol intoxication, and perhaps some herbal preparations with mild sedative effects. You remain conscious and fully aware during operations, held down by assistants, while the healer cuts, stitches, and manipulates damaged tissues. The psychological trauma of surgery can be as devastating as the physical injury. Dental care is particularly horrifying. Tooth extraction is performed with crude metal pliers while you're held down by multiple people. There's no anesthesia beyond alcohol, and the risk of jaw fracture, nerve damage, and fatal infection is substantial. Many people choose to live with excruciating dental pain rather than risk the cure. Wound treatment involves cleaning injuries with water that may be contaminated, applying honey, which does have antibacterial properties, and bandaging with linen strips that aren't necessarily clean. While honey treatment is surprisingly effective, the other aspects of wound care often introduce infections that prove more dangerous than the original injury. Broken bones are set using wooden splints and linen wrappings, but there's no understanding of proper alignment or healing processes. Many fractures heal poorly, leaving patients with permanent deformities, chronic pain, and reduced mobility. Compound fractures, where bone breaks through skin, are usually fatal due to infection. Eye diseases are common due to sand exposure, bright sunlight, and poor sanitation, but treatments often cause more damage than the original condition. Copper salts are applied directly to infected eyes, causing chemical burns. Sharp instruments are used to scrape away infected tissue, often damaging healthy structures and causing blindness. Parasitic infections are endemic, but poorly understood. Worms in the digestive system are treated with purgatives that cause violent diarrhea and dehydration. Guinea worm infections, where parasites emerge through skin lesions, are treated by slowly winding the worm around a stick over several days, a process that's excruciating and often causes secondary infections. Respiratory diseases from dust and smoke exposure are treated with inhalation of various herbal preparations, some helpful, but others toxic. Lung problems are often attributed to spiritual causes and treated with elaborate rituals rather than effective medical intervention. Childbirth is particularly dangerous for women, with maternal mortality rates that would be shocking by modern standards. Midwives assist in delivery, but their knowledge is based on tradition rather than anatomy. Complications like breached births, hemorrhaging, or infections often prove fatal for both mother and child. Contraception and abortion are attempted using dangerous methods that frequently cause more harm than pregnancy itself. Herbal preparations designed to prevent conception or induce miscarriage often contain toxic substances that poison the woman. Physical methods of abortion cause internal injuries, infections, and bleeding that can be fatal. Mental illness is universally attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment, leading to treatments that are essentially torture. Patients are restrained, beaten, subjected to extreme temperatures, or given toxic substances that cause hallucinations and further mental deterioration. Skin diseases are common due to poor hygiene, contaminated water, and constant exposure to irritants. But treatments often worsen the conditions. Caustic substances are applied to infected areas, causing chemical burns. Open wounds are packed with materials that introduce new infections. The cost of medical treatment creates impossible choices for poor families. Effective treatments, when available, are expensive and often require ongoing payments to healers and priests. Many families choose to let sick members die rather than impoverish the entire household seeking medical care. Medical knowledge is closely guarded by healing priests and passed down through hereditary lines rather than being systematically studied and improved. This means that medical errors and ineffective treatments are perpetuated for generations without correction or advancement. Pharmaceutical preparations are inconsistent and often contaminated. Herbal medicines are prepared without standardized dosages or quality control. Many remedies contain toxic substances that cause additional health problems. The same preparation might be helpful in small doses, but poisonous in larger quantities. Preventive medicine is virtually non existent beyond basic hygiene recommendations that are often impossible to follow given living conditions. There's no understanding of disease transmission, so epidemics spread rapidly through communities without effective intervention. The psychological impact of primitive medical care creates additional suffering for patients and families. The knowledge that illness likely means death or permanent disability, combined with the brutality of available treatments, creates anxiety and despair that compound physical ailments. Religious requirements often conflict with medical needs. Certain treatments may be prohibited during religious periods. Ritual purity requirements may prevent necessary medical care. Patients may refuse effective treatments if they conflict with religious beliefs about divine will and spiritual causation of disease. The integration of medicine with religion means that healers spend significant time on ritual and ceremonial activities rather than developing practical medical skills. Medical training emphasizes memorization of religious texts and magical formulas rather than anatomical knowledge or clinical experience. As you lie awake at night, listening to a family member moan in pain from an illness that could be easily treated with modern medicine, you face the horrible reality that in ancient Egypt, disease is often a death sentence disguised as a medical condition. The cure may be worse than the disease, and survival often depends more on luck than treatment. In the complex social hierarchy of ancient Egypt, women occupy a paradoxical position that would confuse and frustrate modern observers. While Egyptian women enjoy legal rights that surpass those available to women in many other ancient civilizations, the daily reality of their lives involves backbreaking labor, constant danger, and suffering that these legal protections do little to alleviate. Your legal status as a woman in ancient Egypt is remarkably progressive by ancient standards. You can own property independently of your husband, enter into business contracts, file lawsuits, and even initiate divorce proceedings. You can inherit land and possessions, manage your own finances, and make decisions about your children's upbringing. These rights exist on papyrus scrolls and in legal documents, but they provide little comfort when you're grinding grain for hours in the scorching heat. The daily reality of women's work in ancient Egypt would break most modern people within days. Your primary responsibility is food preparation, particularly the grinding of grain into flour using heavy stone querns. This process requires hours of circular motion with your entire upper body, gradually destroying your joints, spine, and muscular system, while producing just enough flour for your family's daily bread. The quernstones weigh dozens of pounds and must be operated with precise technique to avoid injury. The grinding motion requires you to kneel or squat for hours, placing enormous strain on your knees, hips, and lower back. The repetitive circular movement destroys your shoulder joints and wrists over time, leaving many women permanently disabled by their 30s. The grain itself contributes to your suffering as stone particles from the quern contaminate the flour, creating an abrasive mixture that damages your hands and wrists during the grinding process. The fine stone dust created during grinding contributes to respiratory problems that worsen throughout your life, eventually causing painful and debilitating lung disease. Water collection and transportation represent another major burden that falls primarily on women. You must walk to the Nile multiple times daily, often traveling significant distances while carrying heavy clay vessels. The filled water jars weigh 40 to 60 pounds and must be balanced on your head or shoulders, causing severe neck and spinal damage over years of repetitive strain. The path to water sources is treacherous, involving navigation of steep riverbanks, muddy terrain, and areas frequented by dangerous animals. Crocodile attacks on women collecting water are documented in ancient records, and the constant fear of predation adds psychological stress to an already physically demanding task. Textile production consumes enormous amounts of women's time and energy. You must spin thread using simple spindles, a process that requires hours of precise hand movements and causes repetitive stress injuries to your fingers, wrists, and arms. The linen fibers are coarse and cause cuts and irritation to your hands during processing. Weaving cloth on primitive looms requires you to maintain awkward positions for extended periods while performing intricate manipulations with your hands and feet. The tension required to operate these looms causes joint damage, and the fine detail work strains your eyes in poor lighting conditions. Childcare responsibilities begin early and never end throughout your reproductive years. Egyptian women typically begin bearing children in their early teens and continue having babies until menopause or death, whichever comes first. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing takes an enormous toll on your body and health. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt is dangerous and often fatal. Maternal mortality rates are astronomical by modern standards, with many women dying from complications during delivery or in the weeks following childbirth. There's no prenatal care, no understanding of nutritional needs during pregnancy, and no medical intervention for delivery complications. Labor and delivery take place in hot, unsanitary conditions with assistance from midwives whose knowledge is based on tradition rather than medical understanding. Pain relief during childbirth is limited to herbal preparations that may be ineffective or dangerous. Many women die from hemorrhaging, infection, or complications that would be easily treatable with modern medical care. The postpartum period brings additional dangers as new mothers must return to full work responsibilities within days of giving birth, regardless of their physical condition. There's no concept of maternity leave or recovery time. The demands of survival don't pause for childbirth. Infant and child mortality rates are so high that mothers expect to lose multiple children during their lifetimes. The emotional toll of watching your children die from preventable diseases, malnutrition, or accidents adds psychological trauma to the physical demands of motherhood. Menstruation brings additional burdens, as women are considered ritually impure during their periods and must isolate themselves from normal activities. This isolation doesn't excuse them from work responsibilities, but adds shame and social restrictions to an already difficult existence. Menstrual hygiene products don't exist, forcing women to use rags, plant materials, or nothing at all during their periods. The lack of proper protection creates health risks and social embarrassment that compound the natural discomfort of menstruation. Marriage arrangements are typically made by families for economic or political reasons rather than personal choice. Women have little control over whom they marry or when, though they do have the right to divorce, a right that's difficult to exercise when you're economically dependent on your husband for survival. Domestic violence is common and largely ignored by authorities unless it becomes extreme enough to interfere with a woman's work productivity. The legal right to file complaints provides little practical protection when you're physically weaker than your abuser and economically dependent on him for survival. Sexual assault and rape are constant threats, particularly for women working alone or traveling to collect water and materials. The legal system theoretically protects women from sexual violence, but enforcement is inconsistent and often depends on the social status of the perpetrator versus the victim. Women who achieve positions of power or influence, such as priestesses or successful businesswomen, face unique challenges, including resentment from men who view female success as unnatural. These women must constantly prove their worthiness while navigating complex social and political relationships that can turn dangerous without warning. The wealthy women who become pharaohs or achieve high status do so by essentially abandoning traditional female roles and adopting male characteristics and behaviors. Their success doesn't improve conditions for ordinary women, but rather proves the exception to the rule of female subjugation. Educational opportunities for women are limited to domestic skills and basic religious knowledge. While some wealthy women learn to read and write, the vast majority remain illiterate and dependent on others for any interaction with the legal and bureaucratic systems that supposedly protect their rights. Religious obligations add another layer of burden to women's lives, as they're responsible for maintaining household shrines, preparing religious offerings, and ensuring their family's spiritual welfare. These duties require time and resources that could otherwise be devoted to economic survival. The aging process is particularly cruel to Egyptian women, as years of physical labor destroy their bodies by their 30s and 40s. Women who survive to old age often become burdens on their families, unable to work, but still requiring food and care that strains household resources. As you collapse into exhausted sleep each night, your body aching from another day of grinding grain, hauling water, and caring for children, while your legal rights gather dust in some scribe's archive, you understand the cruel irony of ancient Egyptian gender relations. You have rights without relief, freedom without comfort, and equality without equity. As the sun sets on another punishing day in ancient Egypt, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that mirror the heat-baked landscape, you might find yourself wondering how long you can endure this relentless struggle for survival. The answer, based on ancient records and skeletal evidence, would shock and terrify you. Most ancient Egyptians didn't live to see their 35th birthday. Life expectancy in ancient Egypt was brutally short by modern standards. But the statistics tell only part of the horrifying story. If you manage to survive your first 5 years, a significant challenge given the infant mortality rate of nearly 50%, you might reasonably expect to live into your early 30s if you were male, slightly longer if you were female, and survived the repeated dangers of childbirth. The leading causes of death read like a catalog of human suffering that modern medicine has largely conquered. Infectious diseases killed more ancient Egyptians than the war, accidents, and violence combined. Malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes breeding in Nile irrigation channels, caused recurring fevers that weakened immune systems and often proved fatal. Tuberculosis spread in crowded living conditions with poor ventilation, destroyed lungs, and slowly suffocated its victims. Parasitic infections were virtually universal among ancient Egyptians, with most people hosting multiple species of internal parasites simultaneously. Schistosomiasis, caused by blood flukes in Nile water, led to chronic pain, organ damage, and bladder cancer. Guinea worm disease caused excruciating pain as meter-long parasites emerged through skin lesions over a period of weeks or months. Gastrointestinal diseases from contaminated food and water killed quickly and efficiently. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever caused rapid dehydration and death, particularly among children and the elderly. The combination of poor sanitation, contaminated water sources, and limited understanding of disease transmission created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases to sweep through communities. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made populations vulnerable to diseases that well-nourished people might survive. The diet of bread, beer, and occasional vegetables provided calories but lacked essential vitamins and minerals. Scurvy, rickets, and other nutritional deficiency diseases were common, particularly among the poor who had limited access to varied foods. Workplace injuries and occupational diseases killed workers in their prime productive years. Construction workers died in falls, cave-ins, and accidents with heavy machinery. Farmers were injured by animals, tools, and equipment. Quarry workers developed lung diseases from stone dust that caused painful deaths from silicosis and other respiratory conditions. Heat-related deaths during summer months claimed victims across all age groups, but particularly affected the elderly, children, and those with chronic health conditions. Heat stroke, dehydration, and heat exhaustion killed quickly and could strike anyone exposed to the merciless Egyptian sun for too long. Violence, while not the leading cause of death, contributed significantly to mortality rates. Egypt was frequently at war with neighboring civilizations, and military campaigns resulted in massive casualties among young men who formed the backbone of Egyptian armies. Domestic violence, criminal activity, and judicial executions added to the death toll. Accidents were common and often fatal due to dangerous working conditions and primitive safety measures. Falls from construction sites, drowning in irrigation channels, and injuries from tools and animals killed regularly. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that injuries that would be minor today often proved fatal due to infection or complications. Childbirth remained one of the most dangerous activities a woman could undertake throughout her reproductive years. Maternal mortality rates approached 10% for each pregnancy, meaning that Women who bore multiple children faced cumulative risks that often proved fatal. Hemorrhaging, infection, and delivery complications killed both mothers and infants at appalling rates. The psychological toll of living with constant death contributed to shortened lifespans through stress-related illnesses and risky behaviors. Watching family members, friends, and community members die regularly from preventable causes created chronic anxiety and depression that manifested in physical symptoms and poor health outcomes. Seasonal patterns of death reflected the harsh realities of Egyptian life. Summer months brought heat-related deaths and increased rates of waterborne diseases. Flood seasons caused drowning and increased parasitic infections. Harvest times brought accidents and overexertion deaths as people worked desperately to gather crops before they spoiled. Social class dramatically affected life expectancy, with the wealthy living significantly longer than the poor due to better nutrition, safer working conditions, and access to medical care. However, even pharaohs and nobles rarely lived past 50, and many died in their 30s from diseases that affected all social levels. The compression of life experiences into such short time frames meant that childhood ended abruptly around age 12 or 13, when young people took on adult responsibilities. Marriage, reproduction, and career development all occurred within a narrow window of years before physical decline and death claimed most adults. Religious beliefs about the afterlife may have developed partly as psychological coping mechanisms for dealing with the reality of short, difficult lives. The promise of eternal existence in the field of reeds provided hope that suffering in this world would be rewarded with peace and abundance in the next. Family structures adapted to high mortality rates through practices like polygamy, early marriage, and extended kinship networks that could care for orphaned children and widowed spouses. The expectation of early death shaped social institutions and cultural practices in fundamental ways. Medical knowledge was limited by the short lifespans of both patients and healers. Chronic diseases that develop over decades were rarely observed or understood because few people lived long enough for these conditions to manifest. Medical practitioners had limited time to accumulate experience and knowledge before they themselves succumbed to the diseases they were trying to treat. The economic impact of short lifespans created a society in constant crisis, with high dependency ratios, as large numbers of children and elderly people required care from a small population of healthy adults. Productivity was limited by the constant need to train new workers to replace those who died young. Archaeological evidence from cemeteries reveals the harsh reality of ancient Egyptian mortality patterns. Mass graves contain the remains of people who died during epidemic outbreaks. Individual burials show evidence of chronic diseases, malnutrition, and violent deaths. The skeletal remains tell stories of lives cut short by preventable suffering. The psychological development of children growing up with such high mortality rates shaped personalities and worldviews in ways that modern people struggle to understand. Children who expected to lose parents, siblings, and friends regularly developed different approaches to attachment, planning, and emotional investment in relationships. Educational systems were necessarily abbreviated because there was limited time to transmit knowledge and skills to the next generation. Most learning occurred through apprenticeships and direct observation rather than formal schooling, because extended education was a luxury that few families could afford given their short lifespans. The concentration of deaths in young adulthood meant that society lost its most productive members just as they reached peak capability. This pattern created perpetual shortages of skilled workers, experienced leaders, and knowledgeable specialists, contributing to technological and social stagnation. Marriage and family planning were heavily influenced by mortality expectations. Couples typically had many children in hopes that some would survive to adulthood. The emotional distance that parents maintained from young children was partly a protective mechanism against the grief of inevitable loss. Inheritance laws and property transfer systems developed around the assumption that property owners would die young, often before their children reached maturity. This created complex legal frameworks for managing estates and caring for orphaned minors. But these systems often failed during crises. The acceleration of aging due to harsh living conditions meant that people who survived to their 30s often appeared elderly by modern standards. Years of hard labor, poor nutrition, and exposure to environmental hazards aged bodies rapidly, making even young adults appear worn and decrepit. Physical evidence from mummies and skeletal remains shows the cumulative damage of short but brutal lives. Spines curved from heavy labor, joints destroyed by repetitive motion, teeth worn to nubs by sandy food, and bones marked by repeated injuries tell the story of bodies pushed beyond their limits from childhood to early death. The knowledge that life would be short influenced daily decisions about risk, work, and relationships. People took desperate chances because the alternative was slow starvation. They worked despite injuries because stopping meant death. They accepted dangerous conditions because safety was an unaffordable luxury. Social mobility was limited not just by class barriers, but by time constraints. The few years between childhood and death provided little opportunity for education, skill development, or career advancement. Most people died in the same social position they were born into, trapped by circumstances and short lifespans. The development of elaborate afterlife beliefs and burial practices may have reflected the psychological need to find meaning in lives that were brief and often brutal. The investment of enormous resources in tombs and mummification represented hope that death was not the end, but a transition to something better. As you lie on your reed mat in the stifling heat, listening to the sounds of a family member struggling with illness in the next room, you're forced to confront the mathematical reality of your situation. The odds are that you won't live to see 40, that many of your children will die before reaching adulthood, and that your entire existence will be compressed into a few short years of suffering, punctuated by brief moments of relief. This knowledge shapes every decision you make, every relationship you form, and every hope you dare to entertain. In ancient Egypt, life isn't just difficult, it's desperately short, making every day a precious commodity that must be carefully managed while knowing that time is running out faster than you can count. Death in ancient Egypt isn't an ending. It's the beginning of the most terrifying examination you'll ever face, while your exhausted body finally finds a relief from the heat, sand, and endless labor, your soul embarks on a journey through the underworld that makes your earthly suffering seem like a pleasant vacation. The afterlife isn't a peaceful rest, but a bureaucratic nightmare where one wrong answer means eternal obliteration. Your journey begins the moment your last breath escapes your lips. According to Egyptian belief, your soul separates into multiple components that must navigate a complex underworld filled with demons, monsters, and divine interrogators who view human souls as guilty until proven innocent. There's no automatic admission to paradise. You must earn your way through a series of increasingly difficult challenges that would challenge even the most righteous person. The initial journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, requires you to traverse a landscape more hostile than the worst Egyptian desert. You travel through regions of fire where demons with knives attack souls, areas of complete darkness where you can become lost forever, and pools of boiling blood that can destroy your spiritual essence. The geography itself is designed to trap and destroy the unprepared. Along the way, you encounter guardians who demand passwords, demons who test your resolve, and monsters who exist solely to devour souls. The Serpent of Chaos, a massive snake that threatens to swallow the sun itself, coils through the underworld, seeking to destroy any soul it encounters. Lake of Fire stretches across your path, and you must find the correct words to cross safely or be consumed by flames that burn for eternity. Your knowledge of proper spells and incantations, recorded in the Book of the Dead, becomes crucial for survival. But these texts are expensive luxury items that most families can't afford, leaving poor souls to navigate the underworld without proper preparation. The wealthy purchase elaborate papyrus, scrolls with detailed instructions, while the poor must rely on whatever fragments of religious knowledge they've managed to acquire during their brief lives. The spells themselves are complex and unforgiving. A single mispronounced word or forgotten phrase can result in immediate destruction. The spell for not dying again must be recited perfectly while facing specific demons. The spell for breathing air in the realm of the dead requires exact pronunciation under pressure. There are no second chances and no forgiveness for errors. As you approach the Hall of Ma'at, where final judgment takes place, you encounter the 42 divine assessors, a tribunal of gods who will examine every aspect of your earthly life. Each assessor represents a different sin or moral failing, and you must convince all of them that you're innocent of their particular domain of wrongdoing. The negative confession requires you to declare your innocence of 42 specific sins, ranging from obvious crimes like murder and theft to subtle moral failings like speaking with a loud voice or disturbing the peace. You must state, "I have not killed," to the God who judges killers. "I have not stolen," to the deity who examines thieves. And continue through the entire list without hesitation or error. But here's the terrifying catch. The gods can see into your heart and know your true nature. You can't lie or deceive them. If you've committed any of these sins during your lifetime, and given the harsh realities of survival in ancient Egypt, most people have, you must somehow justify your actions or face the consequences. The central moment of judgment involves the weighing of your heart against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and justice. Your heart believed to contain your conscience and moral character, is placed on one side of a divine scale, while the feather rests on the other. If your heart is heavier than the feather, weighed down by sin, cruelty, or moral failings, you fail the test. Amit, the devourer of the dead, waits beside the scales with the body of a lion, the head of a crocodile, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. This monstrous creature exists solely to consume the hearts and souls of those who fail judgment, destroying them completely and denying them any form of afterlife existence. This isn't just death, it's complete obliteration, as if you had never existed at all. The psychological pressure of this moment is unimaginable. You stand before divine beings who possess absolute authority over your eternal fate, while a soul-eating monster waits to destroy you if you're found wanting. Every lie you told, every cruel act you committed, every moment of anger or selfishness during your earthly life has led to this terrifying instant of judgment. The standards for passing judgment are impossibly high for people who lived under the brutal conditions of ancient Egypt. How do you convince divine judges that you never stole when your family was starving? How do you claim you never killed when you may have been forced to defend yourself or serve in military campaigns? How do you maintain that you never spoke harshly when daily life was filled with frustration and suffering? The gods who judge you lived lives of divine perfection and abundance, completely removed from the desperate circumstances that shaped your earthly existence. They have no understanding of hunger, oppression, or the moral compromises required for survival. Their standards reflect divine ideals rather than human realities. Even if you pass the initial judgment, your trials aren't over. You must still navigate additional challenges and prove your worthiness through continued testing. The afterlife isn't immediate reward, but ongoing examination where failure at any point can result in punishment or destruction. The concept of eternal punishment adds another layer of terror to the judgment process. Some sins result not in obliteration, but in ongoing torture that lasts forever. You might be condemned to hang upside down in pools of boiling liquid, to be repeatedly devoured and reborn for demon consumption, or to suffer burning and dismemberment that never ends. The arbitrary nature of divine justice means that identical actions might be judged differently depending on circumstances beyond your control. The gods' moods, the influence of other deities, and cosmic events can all affect judgment outcomes. You might be condemned for actions that other souls are forgiven for, with no explanation or appeal process. For families watching their loved ones die, the knowledge of this terrifying judgment process adds enormous anxiety to grief. They must worry not just about loss, but about whether their deceased relatives will survive the underworld trials and achieve peaceful afterlife existence. The possibility that even good people might fail judgment and be destroyed forever haunts the living. The preparation required for afterlife success consumes enormous resources that living families can barely afford. Proper mummification, burial goods, religious texts, and tomb construction all represent investments in the deceased's afterlife prospects. Families often impoverish themselves, trying to provide adequate spiritual preparation for their dead relatives. The uncertainty of judgment outcomes means that even elaborate preparation provides no guarantee of success. Wealthy individuals with extensive burial goods and detailed religious texts still face the same terrifying examination as poor souls with minimal preparation. Divine judgment operates according to moral rather than economic principles. The knowledge of this impending judgment shapes behavior during life, but not always in positive ways. Some people become paralyzed by fear of divine punishment, unable to make decisions or take necessary actions. Others become fatalistic, believing that judgment is predetermined and their actions don't matter. As your soul stands before the scales of justice, watching Amit's jaws open in anticipation of devouring your heart, you realize that death in ancient Egypt isn't release from suffering, but transition to an even more terrifying form of examination. The god kings who ruled your earthly life with absolute authority are nothing compared to the divine beings who now hold your eternal existence in their hands. Even if you somehow manage to survive the brutal realities of ancient Egyptian life and pass the terrifying judgment of the afterlife, your troubles are far from over. In ancient Egypt, death doesn't guarantee peace, and burial doesn't ensure rest. Your tomb, intended as your eternal home and gateway to the afterlife, becomes a target for criminals who view your carefully prepared burial as an opportunity for profit, turning your sacred resting place into a crime scene. Tomb robbery wasn't an occasional problem in ancient Egypt. It was a thriving industry that employed thousands of people and operated with the efficiency of modern organized crime. Professional grave robbers developed specialized tools, established networks of corrupt officials, and created markets for stolen burial goods that functioned as parallel economies alongside legitimate commerce. The irony is cruel. The more carefully your family prepares your burial, the more attractive your tomb becomes to thieves. Every protective charm, every valuable grave good, every religious text placed in your tomb to ensure your spiritual welfare also serves as advertisement to criminals that your resting place contains items worth stealing. The preparation of your tomb begins years before your death, as your family accumulates the goods needed for your afterlife journey. They save precious metals, purchase religious texts, commission protective amulets, and acquire the foods and tools you'll need in the eternal realm. This accumulation process is observed by neighbors, craftsmen, and officials who may later use this knowledge to plan robberies. The location of your tomb, no matter how secret your family believes it to be, becomes known to various people involved in its construction. Workers who excavate the burial chamber, artisans who decorate the walls, and priests who conduct burial ceremonies all possess information about your tomb's contents and layout. Some of these individuals sell this intelligence to criminal organizations. The mummification process itself creates additional security risks. Embalmers, their assistants, and temple personnel observe the jewelry, amulets, and precious items placed within your wrappings. This knowledge of hidden valuables makes your mummy a target for unwrapping and desecration, even when external tomb goods have been removed. Professional tomb robbers operate with sophisticated techniques that would impress modern burglars. They use copper and bronze tools to break through sealed doorways, employ ropes and levers to move heavy sarcophagi, and bring oil lamps to illuminate their nighttime activities. Some criminal organizations include former construction workers who understand tomb architecture and can identify the most efficient entry points. The robbers work quickly but thoroughly, systematically stripping tombs of everything valuable while leaving behind only items that are too heavy to transport or too difficult to sell. They prioritize gold, silver, and precious stones that can be easily melted down or resold. Religious texts written on valuable papyrus are unrolled and sold to corrupt scribes who remove the original text and reuse the writing material. Your mummy receives special attention from thieves because valuable amulets and jewelry are hidden within the wrappings. Robbers unwrap mummies with practiced efficiency, breaking bones and destroying carefully preserved tissues to extract hidden treasures. Your body, prepared with such care for eternal preservation, becomes scattered fragments on your tomb floor. The psychological violation of tomb robbery extends beyond mere theft. The robbers deliberately desecrate religious symbols, deface wall paintings, and scatter human remains in acts that are intended to destroy your spiritual essence, as well as steal your possessions. This isn't just crime, it's spiritual warfare against your eternal existence. Corrupt officials within the Egyptian government and religious hierarchy facilitate tomb robbery through various forms of complicity. Guards accept bribes to look the other way during robbery attempts. Priests provide information about tomb locations and contents. Government administrators manipulate records to obscure the timing and circumstances of robberies. The investigation and punishment of tomb robbery is inconsistent and often ineffective. When robbers are caught, they face severe punishments, including public beatings, mutilation, and execution. However, the high profits available from successful tomb robbery make these risks acceptable to many criminals, especially during periods of economic hardship. Some tomb robberies are inside jobs conducted by the same workers who constructed the burial chambers. These individuals possess detailed knowledge of tomb layouts, hidden chambers, and security measures. They wait for appropriate opportunities, sometimes years after the burial, before returning to rob the tombs they helped create. The market for stolen burial goods operates openly in many Egyptian communities, with merchants and craftsmen purchasing grave goods without asking questions about their origins. Gold and silver items are melted down and reformed into new objects that can't be traced to specific tombs. Precious stones are reset into new jewelry that enters legitimate commerce channels. Religious corruption compounds the problem, as some priests purchase stolen religious texts and temple goods for their own institutions. Sacred objects that were specifically created for individual burials end up in temple collections or private religious shrines, blessed and used in ceremonies despite their criminal origins. The timing of tomb robberies often coincides with periods of political instability, economic crisis, or social upheaval, when law enforcement is weakened and desperate people turn to crime for survival. During dynastic transitions, civil wars, or foreign invasions, tomb robbery increases dramatically as social order breaks down. Families discover tomb robberies days, months, or years after they occur when they visit burial sites for religious observances or memorial rituals. The psychological trauma of finding desecrated tombs and scattered remains of loved ones adds ongoing grief to the original loss. Some families attempt to rebury damaged remains, but the spiritual damage may be irreversible. The economic impact of tomb robbery extends beyond individual families to affect entire communities. The resources invested in burial preparation represent significant portions of family wealth that could otherwise support living relatives. When tombs are robbed, these investments are completely lost, often impoverishing families who sacrificed for years to provide proper burials. Preventive measures against tomb robbery include architectural defenses like hidden chambers, false passages, and sealed entrances designed to confuse thieves. However, professional robbers develop techniques to overcome these obstacles, and the same workers who install security measures often understand how to defeat them. Some families choose simpler burials with fewer valuable goods to avoid attracting thieves. But this strategy conflicts with religious requirements for proper afterlife preparation. The tension between spiritual needs and security concerns forces families to make impossible choices between protecting their deceased relatives and ensuring their spiritual welfare. The curse inscriptions carved into tomb walls represent desperate attempts to deter robbery through supernatural threats. These warnings promise divine punishment for anyone who disturbs the burial, but they prove largely ineffective against criminals who are more concerned with immediate profit than divine retribution. Multiple generations of the same family may experience repeated tomb robberies as criminals return to burial sites that have proven profitable in the past. Family burial grounds become hunting grounds for organized criminal enterprises that systematically exploit the same locations over decades or centuries. The social impact of widespread tomb robbery creates a climate of fear and suspicion that affects burial practices throughout Egyptian society. Families become secretive about burial preparations, distrustful of workers and officials, and paranoid about security measures that may themselves be compromised by corrupt individuals. As you lie in your carefully prepared burial chamber, surrounded by the goods your family sacrificed to provide, the sounds of tools breaking through your sealed entrance announce that your eternal rest is ending before it truly began. In ancient Egypt, even death offers no escape from human greed, violence, and violation. As we reach the end of our harrowing journey through daily life in ancient Egypt, it's impossible to ignore the massive contradiction at the heart of this civilization. The same people who endured unimaginable suffering, died young from preventable diseases, and lived under brutal oppression, also created some of humanity's most enduring achievements. The hieroglyphic writing system, monumental architecture, and sophisticated religious beliefs that we admire today emerged from a society that was simultaneously brilliant and barbaric. The hieroglyphic writing system that captivates modern imagination was actually a complex barrier that separated the literate elite from the suffering masses. Learning to read and write hieroglyphs required years of intensive education that was available only to a tiny percentage of the population. Perhaps 1% of ancient Egyptians could actually read the beautiful symbols that covered their temples and monuments. For the scribes who mastered this system, literacy provided escape from the backbreaking physical labor that destroyed most Egyptian bodies by age 30. Scribes worked in relative comfort, ate better food, lived longer lives, and wielded significant political power. But their elevated status came at the cost of serving as enforcers and administrators of the oppressive system that kept the majority of Egyptians in poverty and suffering. The process of learning hieroglyphs was itself a form of suffering that would horrify modern educators. Student scribes began training as young children, spending their days copying endless lines of symbols while being beaten for mistakes. They memorized thousands of individual hieroglyphs, along with their various meanings and contextual uses, developing the physical calluses and mental discipline that would mark them for life as members of the educated elite. The beautiful temple inscriptions and tomb decorations that we admire in museums today were created by teams of artists and craftsmen working under conditions that would violate every modern labor law. These workers spent their lives in poorly ventilated tomb chambers, breathing stone dust and paint fumes that destroyed their lungs. They developed repetitive stress injuries from carving detailed reliefs and suffered eye damage from working in dim lighting conditions. The religious texts that seem so spiritually sophisticated to modern readers were actually instruments of social control that reinforced the divine authority of pharaohs and justified the oppression of common people. The elaborate afterlife beliefs that appear to show concern for individual souls were primarily available to those wealthy enough to purchase the necessary religious texts and burial goods. The massive pyramids and temples that demonstrate ancient Egyptian engineering prowess were built through the systematic exploitation of human labor on a scale that approaches modern concepts of crimes against humanity. Thousands of workers died during construction projects, their bodies often buried in mass graves near the monuments they helped create. The beauty and permanence of these structures came at the cost of countless human lives. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge embedded in Egyptian architecture and religious practices was developed by educated elites who had the leisure time for intellectual pursuits because their basic survival needs were met through the labor of others. The sophisticated understanding of geometry, engineering, and celestial movements that we admire today was built on a foundation of human suffering and exploitation. The artistic achievements of ancient Egypt, from painted tomb walls to sculptured statues, were created within a system that valued artistic perfection over human welfare. Artists and craftsmen worked under rigid stylistic requirements that allowed little individual expression, producing beautiful works that celebrated the power and divinity of rulers while ignoring the suffering of the people who made such luxury possible. The medical knowledge preserved in Egyptian papyri represents genuine attempts to understand and treat human illness. But these texts were available only to wealthy patients who could afford professional medical care. The vast majority of Egyptians who suffered from disease, injury, and malnutrition had no access to the medical knowledge that their civilization was developing. The preservation of Egyptian culture through mummification and elaborate burial practices created an archaeological record that allows modern scholars to study ancient life in extraordinary detail. However, this preservation was primarily available to the wealthy, creating a historical record that overrepresents elite experiences while largely ignoring the lives of common people who formed the majority of the population. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, divine order, truth, and justice, provided sophisticated ethical framework that influenced legal and religious thinking throughout the ancient world. However, this philosophical achievement coexisted with social and economic systems that systematically violated these same principles through oppression, exploitation, and violence against the majority of the population. The technological innovations developed by ancient Egyptians, from advanced metallurgy to sophisticated irrigation systems, represent genuine human achievement that laid foundations for later civilizations. However, these technologies were primarily used to extract more efficient labor from workers and to create more impressive monuments to royal power rather than to improve living conditions for common people. The cultural influence of ancient Egypt on later civilizations, from Greek philosophy to Roman art to modern popular culture, demonstrates the enduring power of their intellectual and artistic achievements. However, this influence often focuses on the exotic and mysterious aspects of Egyptian culture, while ignoring the brutal realities of daily life that made such achievements possible. The writing system that preserved Egyptian knowledge for posterity also served as a tool for documenting and administering the oppressive systems that kept most people in poverty. Tax records, labor assignments, and legal proceedings were all recorded in hieroglyphs that common people couldn't read, making the writing system an instrument of their own oppression. The religious beliefs that provided hope for eternal life in a better world also served to justify temporal suffering by promising that faithful endurance of earthly hardship would be rewarded in the afterlife. The sophisticated theology that we admire today functioned partly as a coping mechanism that made unbearable living conditions psychologically tolerable. Modern fascination with ancient Egypt often focuses on the exotic and glamorous aspects of this civilization while ignoring or romanticizing the harsh realities of daily life. Popular culture representations of ancient Egypt emphasize treasure, mystery, and royal power, while overlooking the systematic oppression and suffering that characterized most people's experiences. The lessons of ancient Egypt are complex and disturbing for modern audiences who want to admire ancient achievements without confronting their human costs. This civilization demonstrates that remarkable cultural, technological, and artistic accomplishments can coexist with systematic oppression and human suffering on a massive scale. As we close this examination of daily life in ancient Egypt, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the relationship between human achievement and human suffering. The pyramids, hieroglyphs, and religious beliefs that continue to fascinate us today were created by people who lived lives of desperate hardship that few modern people could endure for even a single day. Perhaps the most honest way to remember ancient Egypt is to acknowledge both its remarkable achievements and its terrible costs, recognizing that the civilization that gave us some of humanity's most enduring cultural treasures was also a society that systematically exploited and destroyed the lives of the vast majority of its people. The beauty and grandeur that we admire today was built on foundations of sand, sweat, blood, and bones that tell a very different story than the one written in golden hieroglyphs on temple walls.